friends, and welcome to the second episode of the Charcoal Selfie series. In today's class, I'm going to be breaking down the steps of how to shade in the value scales and the sphere for your first charcoal practice. Remember that our entire focus for this project is not necessarily learning how to draw all of these parts accurately, but rather learning how to work with the medium of charcoal and shade things accurately. So our first step is to collect your packet where you're going to be cutting out this first page where it says Charcoal Selfie, and you're going to cut out the value scale separately and this piece separately, and then you'll go through and hole punch each of these values out of your value scale so that you can use it as a tool to help you work on making sure your values match the shading that you're doing on your practice. You'll also have a second page that's called reference photos. So you're going to keep this page separate, and you can even tear this out of your packet so that you can make sure that you have this next to you while you're working. Because we are going to take that first page and we're going to cut it out. We're going to tape that tab along the top edge so that it's stuck to your gray piece of paper. And when we do that, we are able to use it to help transfer the image onto your gray piece of paper. So we're going to fill in the back with pencil, and we're going to be transferring all of these images. And I know that might seem a little bit daunting or overwhelming to some of you that might be a bit more at the beginning level, but just know that we are only working on shading. We are not going through and trying to learn how to draw all of these things. We're just learning how to shade it accurately, which is building on the steps that you learned from our last project. So today, our only goal is to transfer with outlining our pencil on the top of our value scales and sphere. We'll get the outlines on our gray paper, and we're working on filling in the values for our sphere and value scales. And that's all we're working on today, our first practice using charcoal to fill in the shading and learning how to work with this new medium. So let's go ahead and get started. Like I mentioned, we are going to be cutting out this first page where our charcoal selfie is located, and it's very important that we don't cut off the tab that's up at the top. In fact, it says, don't cut this tab off. So make sure you leave that there, and we're also going to cut out our value scale and hole punch each of the values. Like I said at the beginning, our goal for this project is not to learn how to draw all of these individual parts on our own, but rather to learn how to shade them in accurately. And to do that, we're going to complete this trick called transferring, where we take a 6B pencil and we fill in the entire back side of our piece of paper that we cut out, the one that was our charcoal selfie page. So we're going to fill this in, and if you have any sections where it's not filled in dark enough, or where you have little lines that are much lighter in between the spaces, then when we go to actually transfer these different images, it's not going to show up wherever you didn't have enough pencil. So this step is really important to make sure it's filled in all the way. I would recommend completing this step on the back of your reference photo paper in case you go off the edges a little bit. Once the entire back is filled in, we're going to fold our tab so that the tab words are facing backwards, and then we're going to take that seam and line it up with the top of our gray piece of paper. Once we've done that, we're going to tape it down on the back side of our gray paper using masking tape. Once our page is taped on securely, we're going to take a ruler and a very sharp pencil or a mechanical pencil, and we're going to draw in all of the lines that are separating these different portions of the skill building activity. We also want to use our ruler to trace the value scales and make sure that when we're working on the step value scale that we include all of those vertical lines separating those sections. To get set up for our first practice, we're also going to transfer the outline of our sphere and its shadow. And when you lift your charcoal selfie page, you should be able to see the outlines that you transferred for all of those areas. To begin this charcoal skill building practice, we're going to start out by completing the step value scale. It's very similar to what we did for our last project, but we're working with charcoal, which is much smudgier than working with a pencil. So we're going to first make sure that our charcoal pencil is very sharp, and then we're going to fill in our number 10 value. So we want to be careful that we aren't pressing too hard with this pencil, because since the lead is much softer, it does actually break quite easily. It also applies a lot of dust, which we're going to be using to our advantage. As you can see, after I filled in the solid area, I went through with my blending stump and smudged some of that dust into that space to fill it in nice and solid. For my next value, which was number 9, I didn't have to press very hard, knowing that I could come back through with my blending stump and smudge some of that value into the background space. Working with a blending stump is similar to working with any type of pencil, where if you press a little bit harder, it does actually fill in a darker value. I can also snag some of the dust from my value number 10 if I need to get a little bit darker. Next, I worked on shading in my 8th value, and again I just pressed a little bit lighter and used my blending stump to gather some of that dust and really darken it up. With charcoal, I typically start with my 7th value, where I just use the blending stump rather than actually applying any value with my charcoal pencil beforehand. Remember that working with a blending stump is similar to working with a paintbrush in the way that if it is starting to get a little bit lighter, you can always go to a darker patch and essentially load up on some of that charcoal so that you're gathering more dust on the end of your blending stump and using that to increase the darkness of the value where you're blending. To complete values 6 and 5, I just slowly started pressing lighter and lighter with my blending stump. And once I reached my 4th value, I decided to let the tone from the page show through to essentially be the 4th value. I didn't even have to apply anything. Once I reached my 4th value, where it was just the tone of the paper showing through, I skipped all the way down to my 0 value, which is solid white. To complete this, I made sure my white charcoal pencil was super sharp, and I went through and I applied a lot of pressure, making sure it wasn't too much that it broke the lead, because they are much softer than working with a pencil, but I filled it in very solidly to create that solid white. Moving on to my 1st value, I pressed just a little bit lighter with my pencil so that more of the gray paper could show through to help it be just a little bit darker than my 0 value. To complete values 2 and 3, I just continuously started pressing lighter and lighter with my pencil to help more of that gray tone show through. Afterwards, I went through with a Q-tip, not a blending stump, but a Q-tip to help smear those values into the paper and remove that grainy texture. To begin my sliding value scale, I started in the exact same way and laid out the solid section of where my number 10 value was going to be. Then I filled in my 9th value the same way that I did for my step scale. From there, I used my blending stump to blend in my 9th value to make sure it was nice and smooth. And then I just took my blending stump and blended over the line that was separating those 2 values to help them have a smoother transition. From there, I continued working on adding my 8th value, pressing a little bit lighter with my pencil, and I again took my blending stump, smoothed out that entire value, and then I worked on smoothing the line that was separating those 2 values. It is a possibility that you might actually have too much value on your blending stump because you've been working with darker values. So if that's ever the case and you accidentally go a little bit too dark in a section, you can use scratch pieces of paper to remove some of that charcoal off of your blending stump by just swirling it around on a piece of paper. Starting with my 7th value, I was exclusively working with my blending stump and didn't try to draw in any of the value with my black charcoal pencil. I used this exclusive blending stump technique for values 7, 6, and 5, fading all the way out to the tone of the paper for my 4th value. I worked really hard to make it a smooth transition from our darker end to the tone of the paper where we hit value number 4. Next, I started working on the opposite end of my value scale by completing my number 0 value, and I used a white charcoal pencil and worked very hard to carefully fill in every little bit of texture from the paper with my charcoal pencil to make it as smooth as possible. Next, I started pressing a little bit lighter for my number 1 value, and I just went through and made sure that it was nice and even before continuing on to my number 2 and my number 3 values. Once my transition with the white was smooth all the way out to the gray of my paper, I started working with a Q-tip to help blend that out and make it as nice and smooth as possible, getting rid of any of the texture from the paper or from my charcoal pencil, while still making sure that the values looked like they were decreasing in their darkness. When working with a gray tone paper and both black and white charcoal pencils, it's typically best to start out by laying out all of your white and making it as smooth as possible before moving on to your black, because we want to avoid having your white charcoal mix with your black charcoal. So we want to figure out how to make it smooth before we start adding the black. So we're going to begin our sphere by creating the highlight that's in the top left corner of our circle, and we want the center of it to be filled in nice and solid, and for the values to slowly start fading as they get farther out. We need to work on smoothing out the white charcoal before we begin adding in any of the black. And to do this, it's best to use a Q-tip, because if you try to work with a blending stump for this step, it may actually have some of the black charcoal left in it. So it's good to keep these tools separate and use them for different things so that you aren't getting just a mixture of both when you're working. We want to also make sure that some of that gray toned paper has space to be shown through. So we should have a section of white, a section of the gray paper, and then a section of the black. So keep that in mind as you're working on how far out you're spreading that white. We may also need to go back over the top of our brightest area of our highlight to make sure that it's filled in completely and that you don't see any little marks showing through. Before moving on to adding my black charcoal, I did notice that there was a little highlight down at the bottom of the sphere, so I added just a little line and blended it out pretty evenly with the Q-tip. While looking at the reference photo, we're going to continue working on adding in our shadow on the right-hand side of our sphere. Notice that this is a crescent moon shape, so that means that it comes to a point on the outside edges of the circle and is a little bit thicker near the middle. So we're going to begin by filling in not a completely solid 10, more like a 9 or an 8, and then we're going to slowly transition that out to the gray of the paper. It's really important that we don't bring the black all the way up to meet the white. We want some of that gray paper to show through. So I didn't use my charcoal pencil to go out very far, and I planned on working the rest of the values with my blending stump to make sure that I had a smooth transition out to that gray in the small amount of space that I had to do it in. Sometimes working with your blending stump can blend all of your tones to be very similar in value, so it does sometimes require you going back through and adding another layer in your darker section to really show some distinguishable differences between the darks, the mediums, and the lights of each set of your black and your white. So going back through and adding that extra layer in your darker section can be really beneficial. Next, I was working with the little highlight that I had added at the bottom of my sphere, so I went around it with a super dark value with my black charcoal pencil, and I started working on filling in the values of the shadow that's directly underneath the sphere. The darkest value is found where the sphere and the shadow are actually touching. So I filled in a really solid dark value underneath that space, and I slowly started fading out by using my blending stump. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I hope that it was helpful seeing those steps broken down for how to shade in your sphere using your white and charcoal pencils. Now, hopefully you were able to get a result that looks somewhat like this, and what we're looking for when we're finished is first that you have all of the values from the value scales drawn into your sphere. Next, we're looking to make sure that we have smooth transitions between each value. So if you can see an abrupt edge that's ending at one of your values, that means that you need to continue working on blending it with either your Q-tip or your blending stump. Next, we're looking to see that we can still tell that there's some of that gray paper showing through. So if you did happen to overlap your white and your black too much, I would recommend going back through with a kneaded eraser to try to reveal some of that gray paper as your medium tone values. So I am looking forward to seeing your progress on these. Come up and check them with me so that we can make sure that you are meeting the requirements before you continue on to working on the more difficult parts of this skill building activity. I'll see you soon.
Thanks for watching.